It's a load of rubbish.
The debate has gone on for centuries, whether this cloth is the ancient burial shroud of Jesus, or whether it's simply a medieval painting.
I think that there is absolutely nothing that could prove that the shroud existed before the 13th century.
Could the answers lie beyond the comprehension of science?
You have frontal and dorsal images of a body that has all of the markings that fit with the Gospels. And what if it is a picture of Jesus?
For centuries, an image of the front and back of a man imprinted on a linen burial cloth 14 feet long has inspired awe. It seems to fit the Bible's description of the crucifixion of Christ. New technology has revealed more clues to the shroud's past, but the debate on whether the Shroud of Turin is a sacred relic or a holy hoax still rages. Join us for the Shroud of Turin.
For centuries, the Shroud of Turin has mystified the world. This ghost-like image of a man imprinted on a linen cloth. Why is it so important? Could we be staring into the face of the crucified Jesus Christ? Do we hold in our hands proof of his suffering as described in the Bible?
Crucifixion was an ignominious, barbaric form of capital punishment reserved for those individuals that committed heinous crimes, that were religious agitators and were political agitators. Now the shroud...
For the last 50 years, Dr. Fred Zugabe has studied crucifixions.
We see this torturous flow of blood.
He says the shroud shows physical evidence of a crucified man, evidence that matches the Bible's description of Christ's crucifixion.
There is an amazing correlation between the biblical and the findings on the Shroud of Crucifixion.
The markings on it match those as described in the Gospel in terms of the scourging and the crown of thorns and the nailing through the wrists and feet.
As the torture of the crucifixion unfolds on the streets of Jerusalem, Jesus is first scourged by Roman soldiers until the flesh is torn from his body.
There are over 100 scourge marks counted on the shroud. This is the Roman flagrum. It has 3 leather thongs, at the end of which are little dumbbells of metal. Now, during the scourging, the individual is bent over, and these bits of metal penetrate the flesh, literally ripping skin area and some of the connective tissue with blood vessels and nerves. These dumbbell markings are very, very vividly shown on the Shroud of Turin.
The people mock Jesus as King of the Jews and braid a crown of thorns for his head.
Now, the crown of thorns, which is circled in a cap, would rupture little tiny capillaries, causing this type of feature. Also, you can see blood saturated in parts of the hair region.
Jesus has been weakened by the beating, but he must still carry a beam weighing more than 100 pounds to a distant place outside the city, the site of his final humiliation. There he is stripped naked, and his broken body is nailed to the cross with 5-inch spikes.
First, we have 1 nail in each wrist, not in the palm as shown in so much of art.
Experiments that I have done over the years indicates that the nail went through the palmar furrow. Now, if the nail goes through that area, it will come out exactly where the Shroud of Turin shows it.
It is close to sundown on Friday when Jesus runs out of strength. The apostles watch as he takes his last breath and dies. The Sabbath is about to start, so Joseph of Arimathea has only a few hours to lay Jesus to rest and rush home. He attempts to take Jesus' body down from the cross, but first a Roman centurion pierces Jesus' side.
A spear was put into the side between the 5th and the 6th ribs to make sure that he was dead.
Over here on the side of the chest is the big large area of blood which denotes the spear wound to the side.
Joseph carries Jesus' body to an isolated cave where he wraps him in a clean cloth and lays him to rest in a stone tomb. On Sunday, Joseph returns to the cave, and what he discovers begins a controversy that will rage for the next 2,000 years. Christ's body is gone, and only the shroud remains.
Most of the focus of the whole interest in the shroud is that, is this the real burial cloth of Christ? We may never know that. To me, the real significance is the story that's on the cloth. And it gives you explicit detail of the passion and death of Jesus.
Could the Shroud of Turin be the very same cloth that wrapped the body of Christ? Or could someone have created a startlingly accurate depiction?
I would say that a person would have to have a good knowledge of medical aspects of the crucifixion in order to have depicted it as closely, because the bruising of the swelling, the blood flow patterns, the rigor mortis evidence, and so forth, would take a trained eye to understand that.
For centuries, scholars have argued over the historical origins of the shroud. Did it come from Jerusalem? Some say it was stolen from Constantinople by the Fourth Crusaders. Unfortunately, there isn't enough evidence to prove any of these theories.
Of course, the history of the shroud is controversial because the documentation is so scarce. What we have is an object whose history is very flimsy.
I think that there is absolutely nothing that could prove that the shroud existed before the 13th century. We have archaeological, historical, and literary sources that help us understand it, that nothing else like the shroud could have ever been existed before the 13th century.
The documented history of the shroud begins in Liry, France in 1355. It is first owned by Geoffrey de Charny and eventually inherited by his granddaughter Margaret. In 1464, Margaret falls on hard times and sells the cloth to the Savoys, the ruling family of Italy.
What I find most interesting in the shroud's history is that when the Savoy family traveled in medieval times, they took the shroud with them and would occasionally display it to the locals as part of their entourage, just to kind of attract attention.
At first, the Savoys keep the shroud in France, but when a saintly cardinal decides to walk from Milan to France to give thanks to the holy relic, they save him the journey over the Alps by moving the shroud to Turin, Italy, where it has remained ever since. For hundreds of years, the existence of the shroud inspired wonder in thousands. But the sacred relic was hidden away, considered too valuable to display to the masses. It was only at the turn of the 20th century that a new invention revealed the shroud to the world.
At a public exhibition in 1898, the Turin authorities allowed Secondo Pia, an Italian photographer, the opportunity to photograph the Shroud of Turin for the first time.
What Secondo Pia saw when he developed the first photo stunned him. The negative of the picture transformed the faint, almost elusive image into brilliant detail, from hair and mustache to teeth and even bones in the hands.
At that moment in time, the world stood up and took notice of the Shroud of Turin, because how could they create a piece using an art form in a form that hadn't even been invented yet?
Suddenly, the Shroud of Turin had become not just a matter of faith, but a matter of science.
Tower cleared.
It wasn't until 80 years later, when NASA developed new technology for the space program, that a startling discovery is made. In 1976, physicist John Jackson puts a photo of the Shroud image under a VP-8 analyzer, an imaging device that NASA used during the Voyager project to map the surface of other planets. Any two-dimensional picture placed under the VP-8 appears distorted. But what happens to the Shroud photograph shocks Jackson. It is transformed into a vivid 3D type picture of both the face and body of the man on the shroud.
And this, I think, was a real major breakthrough, because it puts to test many different hypotheses about the shroud, how the shroud image was formed.
Jackson is so inspired by his discovery that he recruits a team of almost 30 American scientists to put an end to the mystery surrounding the Shroud of Turin. From chemists to physicists to image analysts, scientists from America's most esteemed institutions come together to create the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP team. In October, the scientists fly more than 8 tons of equipment to Turin, Italy, to begin their investigation.
We didn't have any preconceived, say, religious predispositions towards the shroud. What was important and what brought us together was a common interest in a subject that really looked like a very challenging problem to science.
Never before had a team of scientists been allowed to perform such extensive tests as STURP. They were even permitted to remove a part of the cloth's protective backing.
I knew that there were millions of people in the world who may have had more right to be in the room than I did. And I felt a responsibility to them as the documenting photographer to more or less do the best work that I could. In essence, I guess I felt a billion pairs of eyes looking over my shoulder.
The team is given 5 days to do their experiments. They test the shroud for 120 non-stop hours.
The goals of the STIRP team really were specifically to examine the cloth and determine how the image was formed and what constituted the image, whether it was paint or whether it was something else.
The scientists concluded that the image only penetrates less than a fiber deep, a characteristic not easily accomplished by the human hand. Still, they had to investigate the possibility that the image was a painting.
I fully expected to walk into the room with the shroud, walk up to it, see the brushstrokes, and walk away.
We looked at the shroud with very high resolution photography, and we could see no evidence of any kind of pigmentation between the various fibrils that are on the threads that make up the shroud.
Next, the scientists had to determine if the image was burnt onto the cloth.
There was some theories that the image, for example, might have been formed by heating a metal statue and laying the cloth on it. When we photographed the shroud with UV fluorescence, of course, all of the scorches that are on the cloth fluoresced and the image was invisible, proving that the image on the shroud is not a product of heat.
After ruling out paint and heat, the team investigates the idea that perhaps the image is an early photograph.
It looks like a photograph, but not a photograph like you've ever really seen.
The Shroud of Turin has no distinct sharp edges anywhere. The other thing that a photograph has, since it's made by light, is a directionality to the light itself. In other words, a light from overhead will cast shadows in the eye sockets, under the nose, under the chin. There are no shadows on the Shroud of Turin, so I think it's very difficult for me to believe that somebody invented photography, made one image on a piece of cloth, and immediately threw away the formula.
Yet another baffling characteristic of the image is discovered when the team looks around the blood stains.
Of course, we all know that there are blood stains on the cloth. The interesting thing about the blood stains is there's no image underneath them.
To the scientists, this meant that the blood must have been on the shroud first, and the image was imprinted around it. Could a forger really have thought this far ahead?
You'd have to imagine that the artist puts this blood on first, and then he decides, okay, now I'm going to put this image to conform to these blood stains, and this image is going to have a positive negative characteristic to it. It's going to be three-dimensionally encoded, and it's all going to be able to be very convincing to a 20th, 21st century audience. I think that's a pretty neat trick.
The STIRP team leaves Turin with more questions than answers. They know that the linen itself has been altered to produce an image. They simply don't know how.
The body image on the shroud is a color change in this linen or the cellulose of the cloth itself. It is not the result of added pigments, dusts, colored materials to make the image that we see on the shroud.
10 years after the STIRP team's investigation, a new group of scientists tries to piece together the puzzle using radiocarbon dating.
There were people who had studied the shroud and were part of a shroud society who actually came to us and said, would you date the shroud? And one of the things that we had to think about, is this an appropriate thing for a scientific laboratory to be doing?
Because the cloth was made from a living organism, the flax plant, scientists could calculate the amount of carbon-14 present and therefore determine the age of the cloth.
3 labs got a sample of the shroud, which was about a centimeter or so each. And the first lab to do it was the one at the University of Arizona. And it took 10 minutes to make the first measurement, and the head of the lab, he's a Catholic. I claim he visibly paled when he said this. He said it dates to the year 1350.
October 15th, 1988. The radiocarbon dating results are announced publicly, and the media spreads the word.
In Turin Cathedral lies what was the most holy relic in Christendom. The Vatican sent samples of the Turin shroud to 3 laboratories this summer after scientists convinced the authorities they could date the shroud accurately using only a very small sample of the material. From the beginning, the results were clear. The shroud was medieval.
It's now finished. It's a load of rubbish.
It's the defining moment. I mean, it's the moment that defined whether the shroud could possibly have been Christ's burial cloth.
The carbon date that was retrieved by the three labs of 1260 to 1390 surely does happen coincidentally to match the date when the Shroud of Turin first appeared in Lire, France. I can only say that that's a coincidence and has no meaning beyond that.
The radiocarbon dating completely agree with the historical and literary sources. What we know about the shroud was confirmed by the radiocarbon dating. I think this is not a coincidence.
The sad part about the release of the carbon dating information, it virtually caused all serious shroud research to just come to a screeching halt in 1988, and it took about 7 years before it started to pick up and people continued to do further work on the shroud.
1532, Chambéry Cathedral, France. For its safekeeping, the Savoy family puts the shroud in a casket and hides it in a crypt behind a grille with 4 locks, each with a separate key. But on December 15th, a fire blazes through the cathedral. Clergymen frantically search for the 4 keys, but to no avail. They try to rescue the shroud, but the grille holds steadfast. Finally, a blacksmith is summoned and manages to free the shroud, but not before the metal casket has started to melt and drip on the folded cloth inside, scarring it forever with burn holes and scorch lines down both sides of the image. But could the effect of this fire go deeper than simple burn marks? Could it have changed the chemical composition of the cloth itself?
This fire yellowed the cloth, it burned it in places, water was thrown all over the cloth. And the problem is that if you take linen, put it into an oven at basically the temperatures of the fire, that the radiocarbon date of those samples starts to change by many centuries. You're good.
Yep. In 1999, after more than 20 years of investigation, Jackson is still committed to resolving the riddle of the shroud. At his research lab in Colorado, he is trying to recreate the conditions of the 1532 fire in order to prove that the shroud's carbon content could have been altered.
You want to charge MC2?
Go ahead. We decided to see if we can, number one, see the effect for ourselves, and number two, characterize all the variables so that we can understand why this thing is happening, and then to be able to make predictions to see if this is a reasonable thing to have happened to the Shroud of Turin.
However, some believe this is a waste of time.
I think heat could not have changed the date at all. There's no mechanism that I have heard that heat can cause a change in the isotope ratio of carbon. So I think that's not a possibility.
Jackson points out that the carbon dating labs assumed they had tested the original shroud linen. He now hopes to prove that the 1532 fire could have changed the composition of the cellulose in the linen.
At the time of the 1532 fire, the box that the shroud was folded up in, we assume, was interlined with wood, although the outside was probably metal, silver. It was probably charring, giving off copious amounts of carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide at elevated temperatures could then chemically react with the cellulose in a way that could change the radiocarbon date because you're adding extra carbon.
There are others besides Jackson who question the carbon dating results.
In recent years, researchers from a number of different disciplines have examined other evidence about the shroud. One of the most significant are the pollen grains that were found on the shroud and lifted from the shroud by Dr. Max Frey.
In 1973, Swiss criminologist Dr. Max Frey lifted samples of the shroud's surface debris on sticky tape. Frey knew that since the beginning of the shroud's documented history in the 1300s, the cloth remained in Europe. But when he analyzed the samples he had taken, the results intrigued him.
There are pollen grains on the shroud that do not grow in Europe at all. They grow only in the Middle East.
Before Fry could finish his research, he passed away in 1983. 3 years later, world-renowned Israeli botanist Avinoam Danin was asked to review Fry's research. His findings call into question the theory that the shroud originated in 13th century Europe.
There are two very important indicator plants that finding them on the shroud tell us about the geography and tell us where the shroud came from. The first one, Zygophyllum dumosum, with very typical leaves. This plant is growing only in Israel. The other plant that is a very important indicator for the origin of the shroud is this thistle. This is Gundelia tourneforti. The distribution area of the plant is only in the Near East.
Upon further study, Danin pinpoints an area where all the pollens could be found.
The fascinating thing was that the area where they could be brought together would be between Jerusalem and Hebron.
What makes this so significant is that it indicates to us that the Shroud of Turin, at some point earlier than 1300s, had to have been in Palestine, which also indicates that the carbon dating has to be at least inaccurate.
I think that most of the holy relics came from Palestine, came from the Middle East. The Shroud of Turin could come from that places, and the pollen analysis could confirm that geographical travel of the shroud.
I'm open to the pollen studies, but I'm also kind of in a quandary as to how to interpret what these results would mean. And it is known in the Eastern Church that flowers are placed around and on top of shrouds. All you'd have to have is this happen to the shroud once, and you probably have all kinds of pollens and flowers on the, and somehow we out and try to make sense of.
The face of Christ or an ingenious forgery, a choice between two extremes.
We've already got the light source.
But a medical doctor from Kentucky believes the answer to the shroud mystery lies somewhere in between.
My theory is that the Shroud of Turin is a contact print made from an original portrait created at the time of Christ's death. I think a portrait of such was done in the tomb on the actual burial shroud. We're going to have to eliminate all other light in the room.
Craig has done a series of experiments where she uses candlelight to illuminate a body, recreating the conditions that would have been present in Jesus' burial tomb.
I'm going to drape the hair just a little.
This light source would reverse the lights and darks on the body, causing whoever drew the portrait to create a negative image.
In that candlelight environment, I am going to do the kind of autopsy diagram that I think very well could have been done immediately after the death of Christ. And I'm going to literally draw what I see.
Using an iron oxide powder, Craig tries to produce an image with the same properties as the shroud. However, the iron oxide dust penetrates much deeper than a single fiber. Craig has a simple explanation for this. The Shroud of Turin is not the original shroud, but a contact image made on a second cloth. By pressing one cloth against the other, the image will transfer to only the uppermost fiber of the material.
The second impression could have been made at any time. It could have been made immediately as kind of a backup, or it could have been made in the 1400s, and that may be one of the answers for the carbon dating.
You don't want a direction.
As a former image analyst for the NASA space program and member of the 1978 STIRP team, Don Lynn has studied the shroud for 2 decades.
The first thing that comes to mind is that the scenario is not, I don't think, is very practical. Where someone copies the image of the body in the tomb. The whole scenario is, I think, stretching it.
A critical test for Craig's image is detecting whether or not it has dimensional properties. Like the VP8 analyzer first used to detect the shroud's dimensional properties in 1978, when Craig's image is scanned into the computer, its dimensional properties are remarkably visible.
Emily has produced an image by hand that has three-dimensional information encoded in it, and the vertical relief is proper proportion between the nose, the chin, the forehead, and so on. She has done a very good job of it.
And that is, to my understanding, one of the key attributes to the shroud that really hasn't been answered up to this point.
Well, it's one of the characteristics that it has to satisfy.
Right. Is it your opinion that this satisfies the characteristics?
Yeah. You have put three-dimensional information into it in the way that you have created the image. Yes.
Well, that's kind of exciting.
Okay. Now, in all fairness, this is only one of the characteristics that the image has to satisfy to basically repeat the image that's on the shroud. You created the transfer by transferring iron oxide or whatever pigment to the cloth. Now, the shroud image doesn't appear to have any pigment like that in it. So.
Oh yeah, I've got a long way to go, but this is, like I said, this is just a testable hypothesis, and I think we've done a pretty good test here, so that's one giant step.
Well, it's one.
Still, most of the STIRP team disagrees with Craig's man-made image theory. But in Huntington Beach, California, Dr. August Aceta experiments with a radically different image formation theory: radiation.
The most popular theory of image formation on the shroud today is that of some form of energy or radiation being transmitted from the body enshrouded in the cloth to the cloth itself.
Is it possible that during the resurrection, Christ's body turned to light, giving off the radiation which imprinted his image on the shroud?
Having worked with the shroud for many years, it dawned on me that every day in medicine we create images through the Department of Nuclear Medicine, where a patient is injected with radioactivity, and that radiation is emitted from the body and captured in order to create a very detailed human image.
Dr. Aceta selects a man about the height and weight of the man on the shroud and injects him with a safe dose of radioactive technetium.
What we were able to do is demonstrate that a simple human model of emitted radiation can come so close to what we see on the shroud.
Dr. Aceta captures the emitted radiation on film.
What we have here is a comparison between the image on the Shroud of Turin and our experimentally created image. You see that the image on the shroud has a salt and pepper appearance, but has clearly no outline. Our image has something very similar.
Even more striking is when Dr. Aceta scans his image into the computer to see if it has the same dimensional properties as the shroud.
When we scanned our images with the same instrument that the shroud was scanned with that created the apparent three-dimensional effect, our body images in terms of the torso and the extremities came strikingly similar to the shroud.
Still, there are properties of the shroud image that Aceta can't duplicate.
The face of the shroud is so complicated and so remarkably three-dimensional, and the head and the face were not. We took great effort to emphasize that we in no way reproduce the exact characteristics seen on the shroud. We do not have any idea what form of radiation created the image on the shroud.
Aceta's image may not be perfect, but it includes two of the most difficult properties of the shroud to replicate. It has dimensional information encoded in it, and it is imprinted in the negative.
I think that Dr. Ossetta's experiments are helping to open the door to the idea that the image on the shroud could have been produced by a radiation mechanism of some kind.
Today, the Catholic Church has serious concerns about the future and safety of the shroud. On April 11th, 1997, the tranquility of a pleasant spring evening in Turin is shattered by a grievous event.
La sera ero a casa con la mia famiglia.
I was at home that night with my family. My wife and son saw a pillar of smoke rising in the sky from our balcony. I called the fire station and asked them what was burning. They said, the church.
Turin's cathedral is on fire, and trapped inside is the shroud.
Io che faccio questo lavoro sono 25 anni.
In my 25 years as a firefighter, I've seen a lot of fires. This fire seemed like an inferno, Dante's Inferno.
Inside the chapel, the fire reaches 1,000 degrees Celsius.
La prima difficoltà per raggiungere la sindone.
The first thing we had to do was lower the temperature so we could get to the shroud. The problem was that the marble dome over our heads was in danger of crashing down on us at any moment.
With the constant threat of collapse hanging over their heads, the firemen work frantically. But the shroud's case is incredibly difficult to penetrate.
The glass that protected the shroud is built to withstand destruction and vandalism. We tried using the jaws of life, but there was nothing for them to grip onto. The only way to get at the shroud was to break the glass.
After clubbing the glass hundreds of times with a hammer, finally it shatters into thousands of pieces. With the shroud safely in hand, Trematore and his fellow firemen race out of the building and into the street.
The first feeling I had is one I will never forget for the rest of my life. The case weighed about 40 pounds. But then I had this feeling of incredible lightness. I felt as if I was flying. Imagine carrying a heavy weight and not feeling it. Then I had a beautiful sensation that I wasn't carrying the case with the shroud at all, but instead I felt like I was carrying a baby boy.
When Mario escapes from the cathedral, more than 5,000 people line the street, cheering and applauding their hero.
I don't remember anything of that moment. I didn't hear the applause of those people because inside of me there was an incredible sense of quiet. I couldn't hear any voices, not even my own.
Mario hands the cloth over to the police as the fire is finally extinguished. But an investigation reveals disturbing news. Authorities determine the cause of the blaze to be arson. Church officials have increased security to guard against future terrorist acts. But time may be an even greater threat to the shroud.
We know that the image is as dark as it's ever going to get, but the background of the cloth continues to oxidize and darken. The problem with that is we don't know at what rate the background is darkening. It's possible that at some point in future time, the image on the shroud will be invisible.
In hopes of slowing down its aging process and protecting it from further harm, the church recently built a multi-million-dollar high-tech display case for the sacred relic.
The case is sealed, it is air-conditioned, dehumidified, it is pumped in with argon gas and a little bit of oxygen, and it is done to protect the cloth from the air in Turin, which is somewhat polluted.
Because of recent events, the church has decided to put an end to experiments on the shroud. Unless a test would lead to preserving the cloth, no more examinations will be allowed. But scientists are not giving up. Schwartz recently proposed a plan using a new form of analysis, digital imaging spectroscopy.
In effect, what digital imaging spectroscopy allows us to do is full and complete chemical analysis of the Shroud of Turin without even touching it. We could then determine a rate of decay, if you will, or a rate of darkening of the background, and estimate how much time we have left before the image is gone.
As church officials consider this new proposal, the Shroud community, made up of theologians, scientists, skeptics, and true believers, is anxious about the possibility that time may run out before science can determine the truth behind the Shroud's origin.
The fact of the matter is that for the first time in history, religion and science are closer than they've ever been.
I would say scientifically, the only thing that we can ever say, and this would be the maximum, is that this cloth probably wrapped the body of the historic Jesus of Nazareth. To say that it is the Christ, that's a theological statement, and that is a statement of faith and not one that's really subject to investigation.
For more than 20 years, the world has looked to science for definitive answers to the Shroud mystery. But is this asking too much of science?
And I think ultimately it comes down to the individual making up their own minds about the Shroud rather than some group of scientists or whatever making proclamations as to what they think this is, and then everybody's supposed to believe that. We should all be involved in this.
You get to a point with the Shroud of Turin where you have to stop and say, wait a minute, what does it really mean? But I think in the end, each one of us has to regard the image on the Shroud from our own personal perspective. And I think in the end, we have to find the answer not on the cloth, but in our own hearts.
"35 popes, including John Paul II, have privately acknowledged their personal belief in the Shroud's authenticity. However, the Catholic Church itself takes no official stand on this issue. The Vatican has stated that whatever consensus, the Church will abide by it.
To discover more about this and any other topics,
Definitely seen as one of the most important religious artifacts in the modern era that helped to not only prove the legitimacy of the claims surrounding the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the contents of the New Testament, the Shroud of Turin is a remarkable artifact that also helps to establish never-before-known facts and information pertaining to the Son of God and his experiences. Unfortunately, despite the massive amount of evidence pertaining to the Shroud as being legitimate, many still doubt the incredible information it holds, as well as the anomalous properties it contains. So today, here at Unexplained Mysteries, we will be going over these mysteries surrounding the Shroud of Turin and what it could mean for human history. The history of the cloth. According to the testimonies of the New Testament in the scriptures found in the Bible, after the torture and crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, he was seemingly wrapped in a burial cloth and then placed into the tomb, of which was guarded by Roman soldiers to make sure that nobody would attempt to enter. It had already been foretold in the Jewish prophecy that the true Messiah would rise from the dead once again, and so the Roman government was ensuring that no one could break into the tomb to fake the body coming back to life or claiming that the body moved on its own to fulfill the prophecy. After 3 days of the Roman soldiers standing guard in front of the tomb, a light in the sky appeared in front of the Roman soldiers that terrified them as they watched the tomb open, and slowly a massive amount of energy, described similarly to a bolt of lightning, entered the tomb and resurrected the deceased Jesus of Nazareth. Oddly enough, rumours had often spread concerning the burial cloth in which Jesus was wrapped in, claiming that not only did it hold the bloodstains of the Son of God, but that burned upon the cloth was the image of Jesus of Nazareth that was trapped inside as the strange energy entered the tomb and resurrected him. Unfortunately, it appeared that the burial cloth was nowhere to be found when the apostles had entered the tomb to confirm the resurrection of the Son of God. This could explain as to why the cloth itself was not ever mentioned in the writings of the apostles, and that the burial cloth had been taken in secret by one of the soldiers of whom witnessed the event, or another that had come to confirm the resurrection outside of the apostles themselves. Considering the fact the cloth itself had been filled with such divine energy, it would be no wonder that the cloth would be a highly sought-after artifact by anyone of whom could get their hands on it. The Church's hidden ownership. Despite the existence of this incredible artifact at the time of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, any mention of the cloth at the time of its creation had been completely concealed from that of the general public, of which led to the existence of this artifact being put into question on whether or not it had existed at the time of the resurrection, and the artifact's authenticity in general. Many skeptics of the cloth originally claimed that given the fact that the apostles failed to make any mention of the cloth in their scriptures, then it must not have existed during the time of Jesus' resurrection. This skeptical claim, however, appears to be that of factual inaccuracy. Despite the fact that the cloth had not been mentioned to the general public until roughly the 1300s, does not mean it did not exist prior to this point. In fact, mentions of such artifacts began surfacing around the time of the resurrection of Jesus, and it has been well known that such artifacts have been concealed away by the Catholic Church, of which holds countless artifacts and documents away from the public. It was not until the Shroud of Turin came into public knowledge back in the 1300s, when it was housed at the Chapel of the Holy Shroud, located at the Royal Palace of Turin, of which the cloth first derives its name, that the public became aware of its existence despite evidence of the Church holding hidden ownership of the artifact many centuries before this first appearance. Since its appearance to the general public, the Shroud of Turin has been a major religious icon of those devoted to the faith, and sees many religious members journeying from faraway lands just to see the artifact. The artifact can still be visited today at the Royal Palace of Turin for those interested in making the trek. No paints or substances. Back in 1390, at the Royal Palace of Turin, an unnamed and anonymous artist came forward to claim ownership of the Shroud of Turin, making the audacious claim that it was nothing more than a forgery that he created himself using paints and substances throughout the cloth to create the imprint of what he best imagined Jesus of Nazareth. This unnamed artist refused to provide his name or likeness, and also demonstrated no prior ability to create artistic works of any kind, leading the priest of whom was in charge of the protection of the artifact believing that the man had made up the claim for the sole purpose of stealing the artifact for his own personal ownership. Ever since this claim, however, many skeptics cited it as indefinite proof of the artifact's forgery as an artistic piece. It was not until several decades ago that these claims of using paints and substances were completely disproven by the scientific community. Back in the early 1970s, a special 11-member Turin Commission conducted several tests on the shroud to determine whether or not the image on the shroud was produced via the use of different paints and substances. After using conventional and electron microscopic examinations of the shroud, there appeared to be an absence of heterogeneous colouring materials or pigments whatsoever on the shroud. Puzzled by the lack of paints of any kind, they began questioning what it was exactly that made up the image of the man on the cloth, and so were given special permission to analyse samples of the shroud. When the team subjected the samples of the shroud to further testing, they found that there appeared to be an organic material on the shroud that was later identified as containing a rich and pure iron oxide. When accounting for the concentration of pure iron oxide, researchers found that it mimicked the properties of blood, as the iron oxide is a natural residue of hemoglobin. Unfortunately, despite these testings, they concluded that the existence of the organic material was not the cause of the formation of the image and was rather a layer found on top of the image. Further testings into the iron oxide residue allowed for the blood found on the cloth to be tested, and the same consistencies as that of AB-type blood, though no further information could be found. Conclusively, no paints or physical substances of any kind were found to make up the image of the man on the shroud. The image on the shroud is a negative. Back in 1976, several researchers analysed a photograph of the shroud's image using a VP8 image analyzer, a system of which was originally developed to be used by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to help create brightness maps of the moon. It turns out that the image of the man on the cloth is not a normal imprint, but rather that of a negative image. A negative image can be accomplished when a person takes a picture of an individual and flips the brightness of the colours so that the brightest sections of the image are the darkest and the darkest sections of the image are the brightest. This has allowed the image of the man on the cloth to hold such incredible accuracy and impossible to achieve realism that using the VP8 image analyzer, the researchers could gather three-dimensional information from the image. Not only would it have been impossible for an artist to forge such a production, but many researchers argue that a negative image proves that the image on the cloth must have been made using a bombardment of high-energy particles of some kind. This three-dimensional information has led to the Shroud of Turin being used to recreate a complete 3D image of the man in the cloth, of whom seems to bear similarities with Middle Eastern characteristics and wounds across the body that match those mentioned in Scripture. The radiocarbon dating of the cloth. One of the main claims around the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin is the radiocarbon dating results surrounding the cloth. Radiocarbon testing of the artifact had been allowed under special permission for researchers to take a tiny sample of the Shroud of Turin and use it for testing. Unfortunately, the sample they took from the shroud was the same damaged section burned in a fire that would have thrown off the carbon results from the tests, which made the test inconclusive. It was not until many years later that testing could be redone, but instead of the usage of radiocarbon testing, they used state-of-the-art techniques by using techniques in vibrational spectroscopy, which demonstrated to researchers in 2013 that the cloth was most likely produced somewhere around 300 BC and 400 AD, which would have put the average at the time of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, helping to prove the authenticity of the age of the cloth. But what do you all think of the Shroud of Turin artifact and what it could potentially mean for human history? Be sure to leave your questions and answers in the comment section below and help us to grow this community while working to solve these unexplained mysteries. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.